Welcome everyone, thank you for showing up for my talk. Just a bit of background on me. I'm a science journalist. I'm originally from Croatia, but I worked in the UK most of my life as a news editor. So I think my presentation will be kind of a little bit biased. I've been kind of working on science news most of my career and working a lot with freelancers and science journalists who are just starting out. So I think some of my thinking has been influenced by that, and I think science news are still driven by individual journal articles and press releases. And I think science is quite difficult to cover. So a lot of people that I worked with in the past at organizations such as SciDNet, the New Scientist, a lot of the freelancers, they kind of needed training. So I think that also influenced my thinking in this field. So I'll be talking about artificial intelligence and science journalism. And this is basically a project that came out of my year at MIT. So I did a night science journalism fellowship there last year. And as part of that, you need to do a research project. And when I got there, I realized that basically everyone at MIT is talking about machine learning, AI, deep learning, there's this sense that you can do anything you want there, right? Students go to classes and they're told by the end of this year you should launch a $1 million company, and that's possible, and our students in the class have done it. And they tell you, if it's not broken, you should still fix it anyway. I got there and I started thinking, well, everyone's talking about AI. Can we use it in science journalism? Could you use it to design a science writing robot, for example? And I started exploring that idea, and this talk will really be about that, my thinking and my sort of research into this as I was talking to various people about it. And I'm also the chairman of the Association of British Science Writers, which is an association of 500 people who work in the field in the UK. So what I found, I'll just give you a quick overview of my sort of findings. I found that AI is already disrupting media, but that science journalists in particular are pretty much unaware of this trend, and I think probably people in this room are an exception, but I found that when I speak to science journalists about this, they're just not aware of the things that are happening. Also, obviously, AI applications such as news writing bots could threaten our jobs, and they could possibly undermine critical reporting on science, because if you have an algorithm that's writing news, the question is how critical will that be, and will they go and talk to other sources and provide a good science reporting. But I think they could also help us make our jobs and lives easier, and I think this is really an interesting application of AI that I've been kind of looking into. And I think in order for that to happen, we will need to kind of step in and work with developers, work with people who work in AI, and try to get them to help us develop the projects that will help us do our job better. So that's just a basic overview of kind of my thinking and I think my message on this. So why should we care about AI and algorithms and things like that? Well, there's this whole issue of algorithmic bias and accountability that Nick was talking about yesterday. So as you get AI, being used in life to enforce policing or used in courts, we need to understand how it works, and we need to hold it accountable, just like we hold any other power accountable. So I think as journalists, we need to care about this issue. And then there are ever more ambitious applications of AI. And I have some examples here, and some of them are a bit old from the last couple of years. But we have basically now AI doing things that lawyers used to do. We have some plane companies thinking about using AI to fly planes. First, AI robot surgeons who basically, when they're tested and things like stitching up the skin and stuff, they perform better than humans. And then, some kind of economists predict that AI might take, as many as 4 in 10 jobs by 2030. And, I don't know whether this is hype or not, but there's certainly some people who think it will affect our job markets and our economies. And then if you look at, actual arts and media, you see similarly amazing applications. So AI writing a novel, nearly winning an award in Japan for that. BBC using AI as a sort of producer of shows, so instead of human editor or producer telling you when to cut and which scene to film, this is now being done by machine for some shows. And then composing music. And this is quite an interesting thing. I went to an undergraduate lecture on deep learning at MIT, and this was the introductory lecture for, I think they were first or second year undergraduates. It's their very first lecture. And at the end of the lecture, they have a lab, and in that lab, they basically design a deep learning code that will write music, that will compose music. So I think it's quite kind of impressive that undergrads can already do this in their very first lecture on the subject. So yeah, I think, you know, we can talk about hype in AI, but also I think the actual applications that people are developing are pretty amazing already. So does this mean that AI will take our jobs away as well as journalists? Well, certainly if you look at some of the recent headlines, I mean, they do suggest that this is the way, you know, that things will happen. So we already have robot journalists writing stories, and you know, some of them are writing. You know, so this Washington Post robot reporter published 850 articles in the past year. I think for any human journalist, that'd be quite a difficult thing to achieve, right? So you already have something that's kind of outperforming humans in terms of quantity, right? So it does make you wonder what it's going to do to our jobs. And then if you look at some of these examples, I don't know if you can read them, but I think these are the same examples, again, that Nick showed yesterday, I think from the Washington Post and from Associated Press. These are stories about sports results and then performance of financial performance of companies. As they're templated, obviously, by humans, and if you read them, like, you can't really tell that it's written by robots, right? So I think they already look good. And this is an example, kind of sciencey example, the QuakeBot, which probably most of you have heard of. This is the LA Times. They have this robot that kind of reports on earthquakes as soon as they happen. It takes data feed from the US Geological Survey, so it can basically report within seconds or minutes when an earthquake happens. And it tells you how big the earthquake was and where it happened. And it's much, you know, it's much quicker than a human could do it. And again, if you read this, it's just, you know, very simple news report. I don't think anyone would say, well, this is a robot and this is a really boring story. It's just a basic news story. And then I think the fact that these robots are already out there writing news raises really interesting questions about accuracy and about journalistic checks and balances. So this is the QuakeBot I was just talking about. So, you know, a few years ago, everyone reported about how this bot can write news, which is amazing. But then I think just last year this happened where it kind of accidentally reported an earthquake that didn't happen. And I think what happened here, again, somebody might know the story, but basically US Geological Survey, they were just updating their database, and there was this old quake that I think didn't have a date associated with it, and it got updated. And because the bot was programmed to pick up any updates from the Geological Survey, it picked this up and it said, oh, this earthquake just happened, or actually it had a future date, but it didn't happen. So I think this highlights that, you know, we will still need sort of in the foreseeable future, you know, human editors and people who will check and make sure that the robots don't just kind of write fake news. But anyway, this is just an example of what can happen when you kind of deploy a robot to write news about the real world. Now, an example that I find quite fascinating is, you know, AI writing research papers. So this is a company based in Slovenia, I think, called Synode, and it's kind of like a company that does. It's kind of like an online notebook for scientists, and they can keep their notes there, keep their references in there, produce graphs and stuff based on their data. And what they've launched in December is a manuscript writer. And what they claim is that basically it allows you to write your paper much quicker. It drafts your paper for you based on your references and your data in this software, and then you kind of just go in and edit it. And this is a quote from one of the users. You know, I think last time I spoke to them, they said they've written about 100 papers using this so far. And you know, these users say it does kind of cut down on their time that they spend writing papers. So instead of spending hours, you know, thinking about how do I start this paper and what do I put in the introduction, it just kind of pulls it in for you, and then you go in and edit it down. So I think it's quite fascinating that this thing is kind of smart enough that it can tackle science as well. And then if you look at the newsrooms, I think yesterday and today we had lots of examples, and this is just to highlight the fact that I think automation and algorithms are already being used, and not just in reporting, but kind of throughout the workflow of a story, right? So from these examples of news writing bots, Heliograph at Washington Post, Automated Insights, there's also this cool thing called Newser, which is basically, I think it just got funding from the Google Digital News Initiative, and what they're planning to do is use AI to crowdsource news, so to kind of look at people's posts on discussion forums and Facebook, places like that, and kind of pull it into a news story that makes sense, and that's kind of like, I guess, citizen journalism. So we have these things being used for writing, for fact-checking. There's a bunch of stuff out there on fact-checking, including Full Fact, and they have like this really cool thing that kind of fact-checks things in real time. I think I'll try and show you a video of that later on. Then video production. Some of these companies, again, like if you have a story about, say, I don't know, new research or whatever, you use this software, you just copy and paste your story link in there, and it comes up with dozens or thousands of videos that correspond to your story, and you can just kind of drag and drop these videos and create really short, snappy videos about your topic really quickly. And they sort of claim they use various AI technologies to do this. And then social media. EchoBox is one of these companies that basically uses AI to help you maximize your impact of your stories by posting it on places like Facebook, and this is what it claims that it does. So it says, it analyzes huge amounts of data to find the right times of the day and the right types of story to post to the right types of audiences. And they're saying like what they're doing is something that no editor, no social media editor could ever do, because they just have access to so much more data and they can analyze it and tell you how to do this. Now I think the feedback about whether this works or not has been mixed from what I heard. I think I was talking to Nick about this yesterday, I think, and he said that he heard that it doesn't work that great. The company that I worked for before, New Scientist, I remember, started using it, and I think the immediate sort of effect was that our social media engagement went up, and I think we had more clicks based on this. And interestingly, before we started using this, we had a person was doing this, and I think that job sort of disappeared as we got EchoBox and as we started using Watch It for videos. Again, like we didn't really need a video producer, because every reporter can use this to produce their own videos. So I think on small scale, this sort of stuff is already affecting newsrooms, and maybe we sometimes don't even notice it. With automated fact-checking, I just want to show you this video. If it opens up. I don't know if you can hear, but basically this is talking about their full facts, fact-checking in real time.
And check facts with primary sources. Eventually, it could be used in a scenario such as this.
There are 10,000 more training places available for nurses in the NHS, but the Right Honourable Gentleman talks...
Yeah, you see, that's not right. That's an ambition for 2020, but it's currently not true. How can we be to debunk claims like that on the spot? But the system won't be able to challenge more subtle claims with lots of caveats, such as the statement, the NHS is in crisis. Nor will it provide simple yes and no answers.
GDP is rising.
Sorry. I thought that was just a really cool example of fact-checking being used in real time, and I think this is where it comes really handy if you can kind of listen to a talk by a politician and you're immediately getting those fact-checked. So I think it's quite amazing that we can do that. Specifically to do with science journalism, there was a paper in Popular Science recently where an actual human fact-checker tested one of these things, and she, she did what she usually does on a science story. I think it was about climate change. So she did the fact-checking herself. It took her about 6 hours. And then she ran it through this, I think it was Claimbuster or one of these automatic fact-checkers, and it took it 11 minutes to do the same job. Now, she wasn't too impressed. Like, it didn't detect all of the facts, and it didn't detect all of the mistakes, but it was kind of, it wasn't totally bad. And she sort of concludes by saying that, in the future we will probably need something like this. We will need automated fact-checking just because there will be so much content that it would be sort of impossible for humans to fact-check everything. But this is a really interesting article to read because it kind of goes through what a human fact-checker does and what an automatic fact-checker does, specifically with regards to climate change. So yeah, I think we sort of have a potentially revolutionary technology that raises a range of ethical and economic questions. How will it affect our jobs? Will it, will it mean fewer jobs in journalism, or will it actually enhance our jobs and mean different types of jobs? How will it change what we do? Does it mean that if you have a science writing bot that we won't be reporting anymore? We will all become editors, for example. And are science media prepared to take advantage of these changes? And I think this is the big question. And according to sort of a global survey on journalism futures from last year, I think we're not ready to take advantage of this. So this survey looked at newsrooms around the world and found that something like 70% of people in these newsrooms say they don't have any way of kind of adapting for the future. They don't have R&D departments. They don't have people who are thinking about these innovations and thinking about how to use them in the newsrooms. And it also revealed that journalists are actually quite scared of, because of that, because they don't feel like they're being prepared. They're scared that the media they work for will have irrelevant business models and that they will become unemployable, basically. So, and then if you look at science journalists as a subgroup, I think they're especially unprepared. This is based on my sort of sampling of people I spoke to about this before. I kind of find that people just don't know about these things that are happening in AI and journalism. And I find that a lot of people, when you talk to them about science, they will say, well, AI bots can write about sports, but they'll never be able to write about science because it's too complicated. And I'm not sure that that's true anymore. And then obviously AI experts, I think, and big media companies have bigger fish to fry. So AI experts are working on problems that are bigger than science journalism, so they're not going to focus on the science journalism problem because it's probably irrelevant for them. They might not even know what science journalism is. And similarly, I think big media companies who are deploying some of this technology or developing it, they look at sort of business reporting, sports first, because these are the big beats that make money rather than science. But I think a small number of enthusiasts may be about to change this, and I think some of them are in this room. We already heard from people who are doing interesting stuff. And I think, how we go about this might define science journalism in the future, right? Some of these technologies that are being developed now will probably be, changing the way we do science journalism. The interesting thing about it is, I think it's kind of quite a new field, as sort of this conference also shows, and we have people from different backgrounds coming together and trying to figure things out. So there is no one expert in AI and science journalism because it's just a new field without real expertise. But I think it does kind of open up opportunities to do meaningful research and development projects that will look into both opportunities and challenges that AI brings to science journalism. So this is just like a visual representation of my exploration over the past year. So I'm there in the middle. I'm not really an egomaniac. This was recommended to me by some fellow colleagues who said, no, you should put yourself in the middle and describe all these people you're collaborating with. So down here we have Alesh Shubak, who's a sort of digital science journalist, and this whole project about science writing bots started when I was talking to him in a pub at a party, and we were just kind of wondering, could we design a bot that will report about science? And after that we had like this workshop, kind of brainstorming workshop, where we came up with a sort of quite a simple, not intelligent way that you could do a bot that writes about science. And some of it was actually similar to the project that we heard about earlier today. that was emailing scientists to survey their opinions on things. And we basically came up with this project where you could take certain parts of the paper and code for those parts to go into a templated news story. And then you would have a draft science news story, which would then be automatically be emailed to the author of that story for approval and further comments. So we kind of came up with like this kind of idea of how this could work without using artificial intelligence. We didn't take it forward because it needed basically quite a lot of coding expertise and time to put into it. But that's how sort of this project for me started, talking to him about this. Then Clement here, he's the guy behind the science writing manuscript. And I think for them, it's a company that's focused on researchers and helping them write research papers. But for them, something like this would make sense in a sense that it's an add-on thing. So if you could have a bot that writes about the research paper in a non-jargony way, it could produce a press release, right? So if you as a scientist are using their system to create a research paper, you could also create a press release. And that kind of raises interesting questions about press officers who cover science as well. If these things come about, will their jobs become obsolete as well? Sabine over there, she works in Ireland, and she has this company called SciencePod, where she basically writes short stories based on technical papers, and she usually commissions freelancers to do this for her. And she's been exploring the use of AI as well as a sort of automating some of this workflow, and she's got some interesting results on that. And then Margaret Holloway at Columbia University, she's done a project called Science Surveyor, which is really interesting, but basically the idea is that if a reporter wants to write about science and you don't have any expertise about science, how do you decide which papers are relevant? How do you decide which experts to interview, who's relevant in the field? And she's done some work with developers to produce this AI system that basically tells you all you need to know about a paper. So it tells you, how trustworthy this paper is, what other papers are being published in the field, and it gives you a list of people who are most productive in this particular field, say climate change, and so you can contact them for comment. And I think the idea behind her project is really to help reporters to report more easily and to use better science when reporting. And then finally, Marin Solicic there, he's at MIT Physics Department, and his research at the moment is involving basically using AI to automate some of the actual research discoveries. I think he wants to kind of use AI to identify research questions to address, and again, the idea is that AI could kind of have access to much more data and information than any human scientist could, right? So that's his area of expertise, and I've been collaborating with him on a smaller project which is trying to develop science writing bot using AI algorithms. So what might be some of the actual applications of AI in science journalism? Here I'll go into some specifics. One of them is automated science news writing and editing, providing automated context. So, creating instant experts. You don't need to have 5 or 10 years of experience as reporting as a science journalist. You could just report in science because AI will help you figure out how to do so. Improving science writing skills. Maybe you'll be able to emulate the best writers. And then there are many more to consider, and we've heard some of them during this conference already, and you might have some of your own ideas. So the first one, automated science news writing. This is just basically what it means. It means going from a research paper, you put it into a science writing bot, write a black box, and it comes out with a news story. At the moment, this will take you, 3 or 4 days, and you'll have to pay a journalist to do it. Maybe in the future, it'll take you a few seconds, and you won't have to pay a journalist because the bot will do it for you. The second application, providing automated context. This is the work I mentioned by Margaret Holloway. And it's called, the website's called Science Surveyor, if you want to check it out yourself. But yeah, this kind of gives you, your editor asks you to write about a paper, so you start by going to this website and you put in your paper in, and it tells you kind of what sort of research activity has been happening in this field. It tells you who to call, and I think it's quite an interesting application. And it's maybe related to the one that we heard this morning as well, the one that was kind of polling lots of scientists and asking their opinions. So this is a similar idea, that you kind of data mining the science papers on that topic and trying to get some useful information for journalists to make their lives easier. And then finally, improve your writing skills, emulate the best writers. So I quite like this one. And the idea for this comes from this science fiction writer who he published an article in Wired magazine, I think, back in February. And what he did was he basically wanted to become a better science fiction writer, and he wanted to write in a style of his favorite writers, right? So he collaborated with two AI researchers who have been doing some work in analyzing literary content, basically, and trying to figure out, you know, are there any secrets to style and to fiction writing. So what he did is he gave these people 50 of his favorite science fiction stories, and he said, you know, can you set up an algorithm that will help me write like these stories? And they did. So they basically analyzed thousands of fiction stories, and then they compared these to the 50 of the stories that he gave them. And they found that they basically came up with a list of something like 15 or 20 stylistic guides. So this is how you have to write if you want to write a story like one of these. And then he kind of went off and wrote the story. And he said it kind of worked, the algorithm worked a bit like an editor, so he would be typing stuff in. And if he was using too many words, the algorithm would tell him. You know, it was kind of guiding him through this process of writing like his favorite, you know, fiction stories. And then interestingly, in the end, he kind of sent it to some critics as well. And, you know, one of the critics didn't like the story at all. He thought it was just words on paper, didn't like it. The other one said, you know, well, you know, it needs more work, but, you know, maybe this is a start of a novel or something, you know. So he kind of saw it as a sort of more of an interesting style that might develop into something else. But the interesting thing with this thing is that it's not the algorithm writing it, it's not a robot writing it, it's just guiding the writing. And I think this is where a real application could be foreseen in science journalism, because I think as editors we often train up new science writers in writing science news. And it's quite formulaic how science news work, right? You need a lead, you need to say who did the work where, and I think a lot of this stuff could be automated, and you could kind of envisage a little you know, interface that could kind of guide you in writing your science news story. Another possible application of this is, of course, if you could analyze, say, stories from your favorite writers, I don't know, Carl Zimmer, Ed Young, or whoever your favorite German science writer is, you could kind of figure out what their style is, and you could, you know, you could fairly easily design a guideline that will help you write like that person. And that kind of raises maybe ethical issues as well, and plagiarism and stuff like that. But maybe, you know, is it so bad if we all started writing really well, like our favorite writers? I don't know. But it is something that this technology kind of raises. It raises the possibility of this. Having been to those examples, I think I focused my work on science writing bots. Why? Well, I think both the prospect of them is kind of both tantalizing and terrifying, right? If you could have something that just writes news automatically, it'd be quite cool, but also it'd be scary, because then, like, well, what do we do? I think it is a clear threat to jobs, especially entry-level jobs, because a lot of science journalists start on news desks, start by writing small, simple news before you develop into an expert science journalist who can tackle big features. So the question then is, if that entry-level job is given to robots, you know, how will we ever train up those experienced science writers? And it has some intriguing applications. So this is something that was given to me by one of the AI PhD students at MIT when we started working on this project, and he was basically using this input from CNN, it's just a CNN article, and then his algorithm would give you an output, summarize the story, and then they kind of do ground truth, which I think is like basically the same thing written by a human. So, you know, he was saying that this sort of algorithms that summarize texts pretty well already exist. So we're starting from this. And then as I was doing this project, I realized that Sabine Moët at SciencePod is also doing something similar. So this is an example of what she does. So, you know, her clients commission her to turn these sort of papers into these sort of, you know, accessible news stories. And at the moment, those are written by humans, but she's now exploring AI applications of that. And this is an example of a summary written by basically a summarization algorithm, right? So it's that same paper, but not written by a human, it's written by a bot. And I think it's something like 8% of the paper, that's the length of it, right? And she says that, if you read this, it's actually quite, well, this is an example. So this is the actual story on the left of the article written by human, and that's the one written by the algorithm. And you can see, I mean, it needs still needs lots of work, but I think, her message to me was, basically, for some of her clients, this will be good enough. They just need a rough summary of what a paper said. Other clients who might pay an extra fee will, there will be an editor who will clean this up. But again, the fact that you have a summary to start with speeds up the whole process. So that basically, by talking to her, I realized that other people are already working on this, and she was actually further ahead in doing this than me and my team at MIT. So yeah, the progress on this. So I've been working with Professor Soricic and some of his PhD students, and we were using various text summarization algorithms. And our idea was basically to use the Science Daily database, because they have a huge number of press releases. And the nice thing about them is, like, they have a press release, they have a summary of press release, which is just 1 or 2 sentences long. And then at the end of each press release, they have a full paper reference. So you can easily track where that press release came from. You can go to the original paper. So we asked them for permission to scrape their website. I said yes, so we collected 60,000 news summaries. And then we started training an algorithm to basically try and summarize these papers based on this training data. And one of the early challenges was that we didn't have enough data. So usually for these things, you have to have something like 200,000 articles, and we only had about 60,000. So that was a challenge. And this is basically what it does. So it takes the summary, it takes the press release summary, it locates the research paper, it then brings up the original research paper and basically trains it, compares the research paper to the press release and tries to train the algorithm to do the same for the papers that it hasn't seen before. And when we started working on this, basically, it wasn't working very well, and we didn't have enough training data. And then we went back to doing something slightly simpler, and we were doing, so basically the idea was that instead of going straight from research paper to the summary, the science news story, we need to train this algorithm first by using something simpler. So we were using the press release and the actual summary, which is just a 2 or 3 sentence summary, and trying to see whether we can train algorithms to summarize press releases that it hasn't seen before. And we found that it does that, so that's like a first step towards a science writing bot, I guess. And the really interesting result that we had recently, that we're publishing soon, is that, even if you kind of shuffle the paragraphs of a story, this model still kind of finds the relevant things to pull out and put in the summary. And now these students are claiming that we are observing a primitive form of reasoning in this model. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm just sort of a science journalist on the team, so, but it's kind of a tantalizing implication if it is true. And I'll show you basically one of the results from this. So the big text is the science press release, and the little text in the highlighted boxes are the outputs of the 2 different models. The first model is something that already exists, that they've tried, it didn't work, and the model in the green box is the one that they've developed themselves. And you can see in the text where it kind of took those green sentences from to create a summary. And if you read this, if you read the summary, it makes sense, and it's roughly a good summary of the press release. So what these kind of PhD students who are working on this now tell me is that basically this is a first step, kind of proof of concept that this works on this database. So now they want us to take the same algorithm and basically go back to the research paper and see whether we can summarize the research paper as a press release or as a small summary using the algorithms. So it'll be kind of the end goal, that you have a research paper that goes straight to a news story without a reporter. So yeah, I think initially when we started thinking about this, we hit various obstacles and we weren't sure whether it's possible or not. Now it's looking like maybe it will be possible. So if that's the case, then what happens? You know, I think whoever develops this, I mean, it's quite an interesting business model, right? You have limitless science news stories without paying any reporters, right? So if you're a university, you're now maybe hiring 3 or 4 press officers to write stuff for you, or maybe you will just lease this bot and you won't have to hire anyone, right? When it comes to science journalists, if we don't have to worry about covering every Thursday or whatever it is, science and nature papers, if we can let the bot cover the new discovery in the embargoed press release, does that mean that we can focus on other stuff and just focus on in-depth investigative reporting? I think that'd be the ideal kind of future, but who knows, maybe it'll just mean that we will be fired and the bots will be doing the right thing and no one will care about the in-depth reporting. And as I mentioned before, would it eliminate entry-level jobs, not just in science journalism, but also PR? I think that's an interesting question. Because if you don't need kind of people to write simple stories, maybe you don't need to hire those people anymore. And then if you look at some of the recent grants, I think there's a lot of money, well, relatively a lot of money for developing these things. So the Science Surveyor, I think that I mentioned earlier, got a $500,000 grant to develop that work. Google awarded $800,000 to Press Association to develop AI bots to produce local stories. I think someone did mention this project yesterday as well. So this is this idea that you can go from the same source, a big report on, say, healthcare, and you can use pre-templated stories and just put in the data that's relevant to different cities, different regions. So the bot produces tens or hundreds of versions of of the same story, but with slightly different data that's personalized to your local local region or city or whatever. So there's a lot of money going into that, and some of the big media organizations are using it to develop these things. Here's another one. It's doing something similar, and this last one I think just launched last week. So it's AI in the News, an open challenge. It's giving between $75,000 and $200,000 to fund one-year projects, and this is specifically to look at journalism and ethics and how AI is affecting ethics in journalism. So I think the fact that there is this money here and there is a community of people who are starting to look into this, over the next few years we will be seeing more interesting innovations and interesting applications of this. I think we can sort of decide to just ignore it and say AI will never be able to tackle science, or I think we can kind of try and engage with it and try and, I think, my main message is we should try and think about how can this help us, right? What do we need? How would my job as a news editor become easier if I could use AI? And I think for me, some of the things, certainly summaries, if I don't have to read a whole paper, if I get a summary of a paper, it would maybe make my job slightly easier in selecting which stories to cover, or if I have some kind of a training algorithm that will help train freelancers, tell them how to write, what to put into a story, don't forget to put a reference or whatever, so you don't have to tell them manually. Again, I think some of those things could be automated and could help me do my work better and faster. So I think it's, if you all think about that, I think there's an opportunity there to develop something really interesting that would be useful to our community. Just a couple of sort of things which you can read up on. So these first two are my articles that I wrote about this. And basically it goes over some of the same stuff that I was saying here, but it has more examples and it's kind of maybe a bit more well argued in there. So the first one is just a blog post, the second one is a longer editorial in the JCOM journal. And the final story there is the one where the science fact checker went to fact check the story and compares her work to AI. Really interesting stuff if you want to read about it. And finally, I just want to mention our conference. So we have a UK Conference of Science Journalists on the 16th of October in London, and we will basically have a one-day program which is focusing just on digital innovations. From AI and machine learning to virtual reality, augmented reality applications, drone sensor journalism, things like that. that. So if anyone is interested in kind of learning more about that, you're all welcome to come and attend their conference. And yeah, I'll just open up for any questions if we have time. Question from the lady in the back.
So I have two comments. When we spoke about the editing of, of an AI editing your news article, I think what I thought about when I heard that is, the way that human beings have been able to achieve and push themselves to the limit and push the limits even is, especially when it comes to things like writing, is they've learned the rules and they've learned how to break the rules. So when we think of AI and machine learning and we train them about what the rules are, and we tell them this is best writing, then I think we sort of limit the scope of what best writing can be, and in the context of what the world is today. Because those writers wrote something some time ago, or they were breaking the rules too, and now we're saying these are the rules, and we're sort of limiting what we can do. And in the same vein, when we think about like summaries of papers or things like that, I mean, it's when bots take over even some of the more menial daily stories, we take away from the way it might impact us when we have time to do in-depth reporting is that, in-depth reporting is not, it has context and it's not in a vacuum. A lot of the daily stories you do inform the in-depth stories you write in a way that you can't always make obvious connections about, but you're able to, like, something might strike or you might be able to make a connection or an inference or have an insight based on those daily stories you wrote. So that continuity is sort of broken when AI takes over that, and then you're moving on to something else.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with both of those. I mean, but just the first one, I think you need to learn the rules first to be able to break them, and I guess the editing thing is more like to teach people the rules, right? And even if you're drafting something, I don't know, if I'm drafting a story, I might be typing in Word, and Word will highlight all the typos and stuff, and I don't always correct them immediately, but then I know that they're there because Word highlighted them. So if you have something that kind of tells you, oh, you need to add this, you haven't done this, I think it could still be quite useful for your craft to kind of help you do those things. And I'm not saying that we should just have bots and they're just rules and you can't break those rules, but I think it would be helpful to train new writers and freelancers who don't know how to write about science and guide them. Because I think science is a challenging beat, right? And a lot of people try, and we have training workshops for this, so why not automate some of that, right? And then regarding to your second point, yeah, I think, again, I agree. I actually have a colleague who used to work in New Scientist. He was covering lots of news, and then he moved to The Economist, and he says the main problem he has there is he only works on these big stories, and lots of his ideas would come from the smaller news stories that he used to work on, and he doesn't anymore. So yeah, I think that is, I guess, a real concern. But then, maybe if you have summaries, you'll be able to scan more papers than you do now. So maybe you'll have even more ideas, because instead of scanning, I don't know, 20, 30 research studies a week, you'll be scanning 200 or 300 because you have, I don't know. But I'm not saying that this is the solution, right? These are just some of the things that I would find useful. I'm not saying everyone would, or I'm not saying that this is the only way forward. I think my main message is that we should, instead of rejecting this and just assuming that it won't happen, that it's too complicated, I think we should try and engage with it and try and shape it. And maybe if you feel that these are the problems, but maybe there is something that you could still use, and then that's maybe the thing that you kind of work on developing. And I think this conference is very good in bringing people from different fields and different expertise together. Because when I started at MIT, I had no idea about coding or AI or anything, right? And the only way I could do anything in this field is by actually reaching out to these experts and trying to understand what they're saying. And some of the language is so difficult, and the jargon is so difficult. But I think you do have to kind of make that step if you're going to develop some of these things. You have to collaborate with other people. Yeah. And then, sorry, just one final comment with regards to the automated stories. You know, I think they provide some value, right? So I think, you know, your colleague mentioned yesterday that, you know, all of his kids' baseball games are now covered by the media, and in the past they weren't. So, you know, that's an added value, right? Like a parent and a kid can now follow what happens in their baseball league, and thanks to a robot, right? Having said that, right, that robot will never write a story of, you know, some kid fell, you know, maybe there was a fight on the football match or something, or maybe, you know, there was a, I don't know, a car entered the field and stopped the game, and that was the really interesting story, so the robot will never get that. The robot is just reporting the results, right? So for those real kind of human stories, you will still need human reporters, but I think it doesn't mean that robots don't add value by providing this extra information that we don't have now. Is there another question?
Yeah, I have one. I want to mention, so I'm the one who talked about how my student plays baseball and the robot writes the story as soon as the game is over, but I'm the one who's inputting all the action into my device. So there's a person behind it, and you can actually sort of determine how a story is going to be written because I'm making the decision on whether that was foul or not. So it is sort of interesting there is a human behind it feeding this information into the robot. But my question, is there any university that is pushing back on researchers or professors using bots to write drafts of research papers? I mean, universities are really tough on students who go out and try to buy a paper or just Google their topic. Are we allowing researchers and professors to do the exact same thing?
I think this is so new that I think they probably haven't really caught on to it, so I'm not aware of anyone pushing back, but I think this manuscript writer was only launched in December. And if you look at the PR information about that, it sounds like this thing just writes your whole paper. We actually sat down with the guy who developed it, and it's actually not that amazing. Like, it just basically does the introduction, and I think the methods pretty well, and some of the discussion, but it doesn't really, it's not intelligent yet, so it's basically just summarizing and pulling in lots of papers. And, you know, if several papers say the same thing, it will kind of summarize that and give you a reference to all 3 papers, and I think it will rank that information as more relevant. So it kind of orders and starts writing your introduction for you, so you don't have to think about how do I start writing this paper. Information is all there. So it's not as amazing as they make it sound, but it is still pretty cool that they can do that, I guess. But yeah, I'm not aware of anyone pushing back yet, and it's an interesting thing to consider what happens if you can write a whole paper without having a human.
Well, do you think that's cheating?
Well, if it's your data, maybe not. I don't know, but it blurs the boundaries, so I don't know. We had a question here and then in the back.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you for this very interesting insight. However, I wonder if this concept of just bots writing science news puts us back in the age of science journalists, regarded to be just a translator. And I think the most essential thing that we teach our journalists here is not just to translate even a peer-reviewed paper, but doing, another kind of journalistic peer review. So is it valid, is it reliable, and so on. And just these translating, that is, in my opinion, the science journalism from, 40 years ago. So my question is, would it be worth also to integrate, as a first step, a kind of evaluation of the content of the paper, because all scientists in the room and the science journalists as well know that there's a lot of rubbish outside in the publication system, and now we skip another part of the peer review, the science journalist just translating also the rubbish which is out there.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, it again opens up so many possible avenues to discuss. So, once you have this technology, people will use it, right? And if you look at rubbish, there's a lot of rubbish coming out of universities in terms of PR, right? There's lots of magazines, fancy magazines published by universities that are just there to promote their research and the departments, and you read it and you think that's not that interesting. But you know, someone's putting a lot of money in it, and I kind of suspect when this comes about, universities and researchers will want every single paper they write to be summarized in the press release, and why not? It's more, you know, more attention. So I think it is a challenge. There will just be more of everything, right? And then sifting through it will become more important. And then, yeah, I mean, a lot of people are still doing translating, right? A lot of science news online is just really short, snappy news. You know, they discover this or that. There's a cool picture. That's your story. There's one website called esciencenews.com, which is quite interesting because it's entirely run by an algorithm. So researchers set up an algorithm that crawls the web and selects stories and brings them in. So the algorithm is the editor. The stories are written by someone else somewhere else, but this kind of pulls and curates the website. That's kind of an interesting thing. And you know, if you have a science writing bot, you could kind of envisage, yeah, fully automated popular science websites that will have, maybe there will be, you know, a website for a specific thing. I don't know, maybe, you know, climate change in one particular area of Greenland. And you'll just have stories of that because we have so many thousands of papers published every year, right? And I think for me the interesting thing is that maybe it will open up some areas of research. So say research in Africa or places like that don't get enough attention. Well, maybe now they have a cheaper way of, more affordable way of writing about what they do, right? Or maybe some underdeveloped parts of research. So I think those are the interesting implications of it. But then obviously, yeah, there will be negative applications as well. But I think we will need to kind of think about those as these things come about, right? And again, like these days, like if you go online, most of the news stories about science are quite simple translations and they'll all be the same, right? You have 50, 60, 100 stories on the same paper. And maybe only one or two stories in the big media is the one that goes further and debunks it or finds a different angle and says maybe this is not all that you thought it is. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, text summarization algorithms have been around since the 1950s. Some of the earliest work that IBM was building on digital computers was trying to summarize science articles and basically create an abstracting service. So obviously the technology has come pretty far, and some of this technology in terms of extractive summarization is actually being used in production. I'm wondering, in terms of the science domain, what is sort of, what would you consider to be the quality criteria for a summary of a scientific article? You know, are there particular dimensions that you would be looking for in a successful summarization? Because I think it's really important for your collaborators on the project to be able to articulate in code, like, what are the criteria? What's a quality summary here? And then you have to develop metrics for quantifying that.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think it'll be difficult to do that. I think at the moment they're kind of using the actual summary that's been written by someone as a sort of, this is what it should look like. But yeah, I mean, how do you decide that, and what we actually pull into those summaries or press releases is an interesting question. A challenging one to think about, I guess. I don't know how and if you will be able to quantify it, I guess. But I was thinking, so the project I mentioned earlier about how we tried thinking about this without using AI, just coding. We were sort of thinking, well, there are always words in research papers that come before the result or the implication. So we found or whatever, we have revealed. So you could kind of do quite a simple coding thing that if you see a word we found, well then take this and this will be in your summary, the sentence or two after that. And I think it'd be interesting to test just to see whether that would make any sense. But I think as a first step, it might be an interesting thing to just kind of look at kind of keywords like that in papers and try and find if that makes sense, if that's of interest. But it's a good question. I haven't really thought about it that much, but I think it is relevant. Any other question? Thank you for your attention.